I fear that one of the reasons that we are here on the precipice of climate catastrophe is that we've been thinking about the world as if we owned it, as if we were in charge, not as if it was a gift for which we have moral responsibility.
My name is Eva Cornman. I'm an educator at the Museum of Science, and my guest today is Robin Wall Kimmerer, botanist, author, professor, and enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. We talked about the relationship between humans and the planet, the gifts we give to nature, and how we can heal together. My big question for you is, are humans inherently bad for the planet?
That is a big question of worldview and our future. And I say no, that in fact, people can be an essential species for the well-being of the planet. But the cultural stories we have heard, that we have been told, and that we end up telling ourselves alienate us from our positive role in the living world. And we've come to believe that we are only a negative force. Oh, we can be. We've demonstrated that pretty well. But where are the demonstrations that we can be medicine for the planet as well?
I kind of want to ask you about your personal journey exploring these kinds of ideas with nature and reciprocity. And I want to ask, what was the path that led you to this work that you're on, weaving teaching and writing and science in the natural world? And if you have any memories early on of experiences that really shaped your thinking about this.
Well, I had the great good fortune to grow up on the land, largely outdoors. And so my fondest childhood memories are messing around in the woods, discovering new plants that I had never seen before, and constantly on my knees, like, wait, look at that, that's amazing. So a love of the plant world is, I can't remember a time when I wasn't crazy about just looking at the world. But the intersection that you speak of, how do we act on our love for the world? For me, becoming a scientist is one of those elements because I constantly get to explore and be amazed and try to understand what's going on. But as a writer, as an artist, that's a way of expressing my care and my emotional response to what I'm seeing in the world. And so that holism of being a scientist and a writer is really important to me and is an essential piece of Indigenous ways of knowing that don't separate art and science. It's all connected with one another. Whereas in Western education, we say you can be one or the other. You can't do both. And that was my early experience of being told that, oh, no, you have to choose to be a writer or a scientist. And I'm happy to say that that's not true.
Yeah.
We need to do both.
Yeah.
I would say another element really formative for me in terms of the way that my work is a dance between Western scientific ways of knowing and Indigenous science ways of knowing is family stories, because I'm a member of the Potawatomi Nation and grew up far from my people, outside of my extended family. And the reason for that is that my grandfather was one of the children who was taken to the Carlisle Indian School, whose mission was erasure, right? Um, and so as a kid, I would ask my father, why is this? How do we say that? What is our story about that? And he would almost always have to say, I don't know. But he didn't just say, I don't know. He said, I don't know. That was taken from us at Carlisle. And so from a very young age, I was aware of that erasure and had that sense because there were forces that tried to take away our knowledge and relationship to land and other beings, doesn't that mean that you could bring it back?
Mm.
And so that has been a really major theme for me of bringing in the wholeness of Indigenous ways of knowing, scientific ways of knowing, and elevating them both for how we care for land.
Yeah, one really poignant example of this that you wrote about in your book, Braiding Sweetgrass, was when you were a freshman in college and you were going to your freshman interview and they asked what you wanted to study and you talked about understanding like the beauty of these flowers. Can you say more about that experience and how that really exemplifies kind of this division that we see between ways of knowing and Indigenous ways of knowing?
Yeah, that's a really important pivot point for me. Um, in that, when I was going away to college, I was going to a forestry school. So I knew I would be one of the only women there at the time, and I would certainly be the only Native person there. So I wanted to be ready, and I knew we had this interview. So I thought, okay, I've got my questions and my answers all primed. And when I said that I want to be a botanist because I want to know why these two plants, goldenrod and asters, look so beautiful together. And m the, professor told me that beauty scientists don't concern themselves with beauty. If you were interested in beauty, you should go to art school, not science. Here we are, back to this division, and I felt as if I had made a big mistake, and that this was not the place for me. As it turned out, I I was so eager to learn everything I could about plants. I thought, "Well, I'll be able to figure out why they look so beautiful together, if I can understand them better and really know what's going on." But it was, for me, a real, wake-up call of, "Oh, you are entering a different world here, where only the objective, materialist way of thinking is welcome, and that a deeply human, emotional response to beauty was not welcome."
Yeah.
So I've carried that experience with me and resist it, as best as I can.
I want to ask about your latest work, the Serviceberry. Can you tell me a little bit about the Serviceberry and why you chose the Serviceberry as the symbol for this work? What does it teach us about abundance and reciprocity?
Serviceberry, which has so many other names as well, but it's the connotation of a serviceberry, of all of the services that this plant provides for us, um, were intriguing to me because I tend to think about the ways in which plants and other beings live is that they have gifts that they give to the whole ecosystem. We might call those ecosystem services, we might call them natural resources, but in an indigenous way of thinking, they're gifts. We haven't earned those berries, we didn't work for them, and yet they appear. They appear, right, in this wondrous way, and the fact that we think about them as or that they are named service berries puts me in mind of them as the emblem for a reflection on economics, which is, we are told, systems of delivery of goods and services, to humankind. So service berries seem to me to be just the right emblem of talking about the economy of nature. How does nature develop? How does nature deliver flourishing to all the beings that are in that web of reciprocity? And what might we learn about our own human economy as a result?
So, a really, really interesting idea that you talk about a lot in both the Serviceberry and in Braiding Sweetgrass is this idea of the gift economy. So, I'm hoping you can explain to me what exactly is the gift economy and why is this something that's so important for us to think about when we're considering our relationship with the planet?
That thinking about the world, let's just take the serviceberry for an example, as a bringer of gifts as opposed to a commodity or a natural resource is a really fundamental frame shift. Because when we think about the world as a natural resource or a commodity, we think we own it. We think we're in charge of it, right? And that we can control its fate. Whereas when we think about those berries or those bird songs or the rain as a gift, we are much more tender with it. When we think about the world as gift, we automatically um, remember that when someone gives us a gift, we're filled with gratitude and we want to give them a gift back. Whereas if it's a commodity, if it's something that I just bought, I don't have any relationship with the clerk or the store, right? I've paid my money, no relationship. Whereas if it's a gift, it cultivates mutual responsibility. And I fear that one of the reasons that we are here on the precipice of climate catastrophe is that we've been thinking about the world as if we owned it, as if we were in charge, not as if it was a gift for which we have moral responsibility.
Inherent in the idea of the gift economy and of reciprocity with the world is the idea that we should use the gifts of the planet, but we should also give gifts in return, right? And so why is it so important that we do use the gifts that are given to us? And what kind of gifts can we give in return?
Yeah. That big question of saying, well, which is really the thread of the Serviceberry is in return for this gorgeous bucket of berries, what can I give back in return for those gifts? And the book is really an exploration of that. It might be that there's a very physical way that I can do that in caring for those trees, in being sure that, managing pests, for example, being sure that there's adequate soil moisture, nutrition, all of those sorts of things that humans have agency in doing. But there are also indirect ways of reciprocity. I really care about those berries because I care about the birds that are being fed there. Where do those birds live? Maybe my act of reciprocity is a donation to my local land trust so that the birds and the wild service berries have a place, right? Maybe my act of reciprocity is political action to be able to really support environmental protection and climate protection. So it's always this call to say, well, in return for this gift, what will you give? And that's the question around how gift economies work, is saying, what do I have in abundance that therefore I can share? And I would say I have a lot of love and care in abundance. How do I share that? Well, I will share that in both tending the natural world and in tending a cultural community to try to change a worldview toward more responsible land care.
You think a lot about like the lessons we can learn from plants, and one idea that you talk about is biomimicry, right? So, things that we have learned from plants and animals that people are now using to make like scientific advancements. And so you also think about biomimicry in an economic sense with the serviceberry. So, can you say a little bit more about that? Like, how might we mimic the economy of the serviceberry, and what is the economy of the serviceberry?
Yeah. I really love how you framed that, and Janine Benyus, who is so associated with this so-called new science of biomimicry, has always really acknowledged Indigenous science as being grounded in biomimicry, and the idea that nature teaches us. And when I think about the ways, what are some of the things about a contemporary economy that the Serviceberry or any economy of nature could teach us, let's start with the notion of waste. we are drowning in waste, right? Think of plastics and everything else, because we have this linear economy where we just consume what we want and trash the rest. We think it's possible to throw something away, right? What a falsehood. But in nature, there's no such thing as waste, because let's say those berries that aren't eaten that fall from the tree, what happens to them? They're used to feed the soil, and then when the soil is more nutritious, it feeds the serviceberry tree, which makes more berries. It's a circular economy. Likewise, with those birds, we think of, does it seems absurd to say this, but the bush is not selling those berries to the birds, right? It's a gift. Well, but that gift is reciprocated, saying, all right, these berries need to get around to start more serviceberry groves, and they can't move, but their bird companions do. So you make something so delicious that the birds will eat it, and they'll carry it for you. They're planting the seeds, an act of reciprocity, sort of gift and responsibility, back and forth, back and forth. And so there's no waste. Everything is used again. It's what a lot of industrial designers call a circular, no waste economy. We can do that. We can do that. So that's one example of how we might model ourselves after an economy of nature.
There's actually a line in Braiding Sweetgrass that I think exemplifies this really well, and I'm going to read it. So it's in a chapter in Braiding Sweetgrass where you're discussing Onondaga Lake, which is one of the most polluted lakes in the world. And you say the participatory role of people in the well-being of the land has been lost and our reciprocal relations reduced to a keep-out sign. And so in thinking about gifts that nature gives, it can sometimes feel like maybe our solution has been, don't use the gifts. As people, maybe we shouldn't use the gifts, which is also tied in this question of, are we inherently bad for the planet? So I guess, why is it important that we do use the gifts?
Mhm. Well, as an ecologist, we have to use those gifts, i.e., we have to consume, because much as I suffer from photosynthesis envy, I can't photosynthesize.
Yeah.
I have to consume. It's the way the world is structured for we animal beings. But the real question is not whether we consume, but whether we consume honorably or not. Do we take only what we need? Do we do as little damage as possible in the taking? And so importantly, do we always give back for what we've taken?
Yeah.
In ecosystem science, these are called negative feedback loops. And no system will remain in balance and homeostasis unless there are such negative feedback loops. For that consumption has to be balanced by production, that everything has to move in a circle, otherwise you run out, right? And that's really the model that we have yet to learn, is how do we reciprocate those gifts that we consume. And the indigenous protocols of what has been called the honorable harvest are a set of ethical and practical guidelines that our people developed over millennia in order to be able to sustain the plants and the animals, who in turn sustain us.
Yeah. Can you say a little bit more about the honorable harvest? What are some of the most important pieces of that?
Well, the honorable harvest is really grounded in the understanding that those lives that we take, be they service berries or a deer or firewood or fish from the river, that any of those are lives of our relatives. They're not commodities. They're not just things. They're beings. And so if they are beings, essentially, we're talking about the philosophical dilemma of eating our relatives, right? And so that opens up the fact that you need to do it honorably. You need to do it in a way that does not harm the whole cycle of life for those beings, right? So it says, take only what you need, never more than half. Always leave plenty for others. Use everything that you take. These are lives. You don't waste those lives. Give gratitude and always give back. Figure out what it is that you can do as a taker to also be a giver so that that cycle of reciprocity keeps going. You will benefit because you'll keep having food and firewood, and the other beings will benefit because you're nurturing them. And those acts of care might be tied up with the harvest itself, but they also might be tied up with land management. You think about things like the use of prescribed and cultural burning is a land care practice that Indigenous peoples have used again since time immemorial. Why? Because it enhances biodiversity, it enhances productivity, so that there's more to eat, not only for human people, but for more than human people as well. So a lot of Indigenous land care science is about what are the gifts that we human people have that we can give back that promote mutual flourishing.
The challenge that I sense with practical implementations of the gift economy and with honorable harvest is that it only seems to work if everyone's committed to it. So if I give to my neighbor, but my neighbor only takes, eventually I might stop giving. Realistically, how can we reimagine value beyond dollars and build communities around reciprocity and gift economies?
That is the big question. Because gift economies have flourished in Indigenous and local peoples for a very long time, where the currency of exchange is good relations. So that because I share with you, I trust that you will share with me. But exactly to your point, Eva, gift economies fall apart when there are cheaters. Um, and so one of the antidotes to that is living in small enough communities that cheaters are not anonymous. You know, and that cheater is going to suffer the consequences of reputational loss, right? People aren't going to share with them. They aren't going to be as generous with them because they've broken the contract of the gift economy. So the issue really is that gift economies work in small communities where you know one another and where there is trust and consequences. And we, for the most part, no longer live in those small, tight-knit communities. And we have also really been made complicit in economies that value accumulation and hoarding, that status comes from, I've got more than you do. And in a gift economy, that would be viewed as dangerous and antithetical to the whole enterprise. Whereas in a gift economy, the person's status and wealth, if you will, is counted by how much they share, not how much they accumulate. So in order to begin this shift away from the extractive, commodity-driven economy that we are in toward a gift economy is not only a matter of creating trusting, reciprocal communities again, but changing our value system to say, no, what we really value is mutual support. What we really value is honor, that my neighbors look at me and say, that's a good person. They really share. I trust them. As opposed to, oh, that must be a good person because they have the biggest house and the most stuff.
Yeah.
But the falsehood is that security can be gotten in only one of those ways. In this country, we tend to think that security comes from accumulation of private wealth. And it does. It certainly works. But in a gift economy, security comes from good relations. And you're going to be fed and you're going to be safe because you have good relations with your neighbors. It too leads to security and flourishing. So to me, that means that we as citizens face a big question of which kind of society do we want to live in? One based on mutual flourishing or one based on individual flourishing.
And again, thinking about this idea of like the keep out sign in nature, right? For us as humans. Do you find that the more we talk about the harm that we've caused the planet, that it only adds to our disconnection from the planet?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. When we consider ourselves to be sort of enemies of nature and that nature will thrive only if we put a fence around it. The conservation community used to be predicated on that premise that what we needed to do is keep people away from nature so that nature can thrive. But there is now abundant evidence that this fortress conservation model is a flawed one. One of the examples of that is a remarkable study from the UN that came out from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate and Biodiversity, I think it's called. Don't quote me on that. No, but what this global study documented was the exponential decline in biodiversity worldwide. The things we know, the things we see outside our window or don't see. But in this truly terrifying report that shows this great loss of biodiversity all over the planet, what it also shows is there are places on the globe where that's not happening, where biodiversity is holding steady. And you know where those places are? Indigenous homelands. In places that are stewarded and cared for by Indigenous peoples, biodiversity is not crashing. So shouldn't we as the scientific community, as the conservation community, be asking why? What's happening in these places that enable people to thrive and biodiversity to thrive together? Not with a wall around nature and people on one side and birds on the other, but together. And in large part, it's because these concepts of the honorable harvest, of the gift economy, are at work in these communities. So humans are understood as taking only their share, using the honorable harvest, but taking because their lives depend on it, but also giving back. And in that giving back, biodiversity is maintained. So these indigenous values and land care practices based in indigenous science, this is the living laboratory that shows us that it can work. And so it seems paramount to me in the scientific community that we come to understand both the practices and the ethical worldview that has produced this mutually sustaining relationship.
I think a fantastic example of this that you talk about in Braiding Sweetgrass was with your grad student, Lori, and the study that she did on harvesting methods for sweetgrass. Can you tell me about what Lori found and how all of that went down?
Yeah, you're so right. It's like a perfect example of this. Sweetgrass, as you probably know, is a sacred plant for our people. It's used in ceremony. It's used in basketry as well. It's really important cultural keystone species. And some basket makers, indigenous basket makers, came to us and said, "Sweetgrass is declining. Can you help us? Let's try to figure out what's going on." And so as part of our studies, the basket makers said, well, maybe it's being overharvested, and maybe it's not being harvested correctly. Let's do an experiment to look at how sweetgrass responds to harvest. So working with our Indigenous partners, we did that. And you can imagine the experiment. We have a nice plot of sweetgrass that is going to be harvested using a very gentle traditional method, using the honorable harvest. We have other plots that are used a little more aggressively, taking a little bit more. And of course, as good scientists, we have a control where there's no harvesting at all.
Yeah.
Well, my wonderful student, Lori, set up this experiment, and the conservation scientists in our department scoffed at her. They said, "Why would you bother doing this research? Everyone knows the result. Um, the plants that are not harvested are going to thrive. The ones that are harvested are going to decline. Tell me, this is not good science. You shouldn't be doing it." Well,
Leaving plants alone is the best thing we could do.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, exactly. But we did the experiment anyway. Um, and of course, what we found out, just as the basket makers had perhaps predicted, was that which plot of grass did the worst? The one that was never harvested. In the control plot,
Wow.
the control plot declined in abundance, whereas both of the plots that were harvested, and both were used with the honorable harvest, just at different intensities, both of them nearly doubled the amount of sweetgrass which was present. The life history of that plant is actually adapted to harvesting, so that harvesting stimulates the release of dormant buds on the underground rhizome, and then they burst up and make more sweetgrass. So in plant biological terms, it's very clear what was happening. Plus, they were thinning the plot, which made more resources for the next generation to grow. So there's really good physical, objective reasons that the sweetgrass responded in this way. But there's also the cultural understanding that if this plant gives us gifts, we have to use them. We have to use them. These have been given to us to enhance our lives. It would be ungrateful not to take them,
Yeah.
but take them in an honorable way, because these are our sacred relatives. And on a spiritual, cultural level, and on a purely objective material, those stories converge.
Yeah.
In this case, harvesters were essential for the well-being of sweetgrass. And so it's a powerful lesson to say, no, 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 no. This paradigm that keeping people away from nature is always going to result in nature thriving is simply not true. The story of cultural burning leads us to the same conclusions. How did we get to over-mature forests that are going to go up in a wildfire? Because we ignored Indigenous science of cultural burning that promoted the right conditions for those forests to thrive in perpetuity.
What really strikes me with this story is the combination of Indigenous knowing and scientific process, right? Something that you had written about with this story was that Indigenous basket makers who had been using the sweetgrass for a very long time had this idea of, if we ignore something, it will go away. If we use it respectfully, it will stay. And yet Lori still had to present this, scientific method to figure out basically the same thing that the basket makers had known for a very long time. So I'm curious, kind of your take on the intersection of science and Indigenous knowing there, and how they found the same thing but had to go about it in a very different way.
They found the same thing because both the basket makers and the plant ecologists are reading from the land. The land is the holder of that knowledge. And whether you're using the scientific method or whether you are observing the honorable harvest, if you're closely observing, you're going to see the same thing. So it is not surprising to me as an Indigenous and Western trained scientist that oftentimes the answers are the same, expressed in different ways with different meanings and significance, but it's the land talking to us. But so often Western science has been an agent of erasure of other ways of knowing. Western science is very powerful, right, as a way of knowing, but it isn't the only way. And the phenomenon known as scientism, this belief that Western science is the highest, best, and indeed only way to understand the living world cuts us off from these other values-informed ways of knowing. It's a kind of blindness. It's coupled with arrogance. But in most of our education as scientists, we are never exposed to other ways of knowing. Or if we are, it is with a tone of dismissal. They just say, see, it's not as good. It's not as good as our science. And so our Center for Native Peoples and the Environment at the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, where I teach, our whole mission is to bring together the power of both of those intellectual traditions to say, how much better would our sustainability solutions be if we used both ways of knowing?
Yeah, tell me more about that. Like, how exactly do you see the intersection of Western science and Indigenous knowing intersecting to make our sustainability practices even better? And if you have any specific examples.
One of the ways that I think I would want to frame that in a way that I talk a lot with my students about is to think about what counts as valuable knowledge. At least in my Potawatomi tradition, we say that every human being has at least 4 ways of perceiving the world. One of them is absolutely the intellect, the power of the human mind, the power of our senses to observe and indeed to measure, right? Powerful ways of knowing. But no one would deny that we also have emotional intelligence. We have intuition, right? So many scientific discoveries have come from so-called intuition, right? And we also have the concept of humility and spiritual knowledge to know that, there are things much bigger than we are that we just really don't understand. So in Indigenous science, we say that all 4 of those ways of knowing should help us problem solve. When I undertook training as a Western scientist, what I was told is that the intellect is a valid way of knowing and that which we can empirically validate physically. Emotional knowledge and spiritual knowledge off the table. We never use them, which is why my professor told me all those years ago, if you're interested in beauty, you should go to art school because we don't do that.
Yeah.
Well, both of those are powerful ways of knowing. And when I want to test a hypothesis, when I want a true-false answer about the nature of the living world, I'm going to use the scientific method.
Yeah.
And many of our questions are there. But right now, many of our questions are not just about whether this is true or false, but what do we do about it? These are values-laden questions. And Indigenous knowledge explicitly incorporates values. Western science explicitly disregards values in support of this notion of pure rationality. And so that's why I think we need to use both of these. How can we inform our decision-making, not just with empirical knowledge of how the world works, but with cultural values as well?
I think a really important idea there in placing value is valuing what you're studying as a subject and not an object.
Yes.
And so a lot of what you write about is plants as teachers. They are some of the oldest and wisest subjects that we can learn from. I'm curious, what sorts of things can we learn from plants when we do value them as subjects and not just objects of scientific study?
It's a beautiful question. And I think that is wrapped up in thinking, we're back to gifts again. We're thinking about the notion of the generosity of the plant world and the way that the gifts are generated by plants that keep every one of us alive. And that can't help but generate an attitude of respect, I would say, indeed, of love for the living world. Because, Braiding Sweetgrass, I talk about this question of, well, we say that we love the land, but does the land love us back? In the Indigenous worldview, we would say, absolutely. Mother Earth takes care of us, gives us every single thing that we need. The oxygen that you and I are breathing right now, after all, was a gift of plants, right? Every calorie of food that we consume at root came from photosynthesis. We are kept alive by the plants and kept in a state of wonder and amazement at the ways that they do this. The beauty, the medicine, the teachings, the stories, the art that they bring to us. And so to me, what that means is that it helps us fall in love with the world again. And I fear that that's what has been lost is that sense of love for the world. We may know how the world works, but if we don't care, it doesn't translate to action. A lot of climate policy folks and have suggested that we know enough at this point. We don't know everything, that's for darn sure, but we know enough at this point to understand what's going on with climate change, right? We have enough information. We have enough policy. We have enough technology. We even have enough money to solve this problem. But we haven't. What's missing? What's missing? We have all the tools that we need to solve this, but we're paralyzed. To me, it's because we don't have the values that propel us to use those tools in a good way. And that's where the values and the moral and spiritual responsibility that are inherent in Indigenous ways of knowing are the medicine that we need. They help us change that story to say it isn't enough to know how the world works. You also have to be in a state of love and gratitude and relationship with the living world to be able to give your gifts to care for it. And to me, that is the real, in this particular moment, the real gift that Indigenous knowledge can give is to propel that sense of spiritual connection to the land.
I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how we human beings can start to find love and value for the world again, especially for those of us who might feel really disconnected from it. Maybe we're living in cities where we just don't see nature very often. How can we start to find that value for living things and for the world?
Yeah, you're so right. How are we going to have this sense if we don't have daily encounters, or at least frequent encounters with the living world? You're absolutely right. And so, reconnecting people to nature in both a material way and in a cultural way are super important. Which is one of the reasons that the keep out signs for the fragments of nature that we have left do us great harm. I love to take my grandkids in the woods when I go to a place, they say, well, don't pick anything, don't touch anything. Like, yeah, I understand that. Of course, as a plant biologist, I understand this. But how are we going to fall in love with the world if you don't pick berries? Right? That's the gateway. That's the gateway. Or picking a bouquet of flowers. It seems to me, and I've been floating this idea in the conservation community, that we need reserves, which are not just about biodiversity protection, but are places of engagement with the living world. There needs to be parks that are set up for berry picking, or for sweetgrass harvesting, so that we come to love the world again. Because what conservation biologists have documented is that as a nation, we suffer from what they have called plant blindness. People think that they're just living, in green wallpaper without really understanding the integrity and the brilliance of all of these green lives around them. But when you live in a city, or even if you live in the country and are glued to your phone the whole time, how are you going to know? How are you going to know? So engagement with the living world through food, through recreation, through education is essential. And of course, people are recognizing this. The educational system involved in trying to do things like the rewild your schoolyard, the tree justice movement, which is designed to be sure that there is nature in the city, is really important. The community garden movement are ways for engagement with the living world in an urban environment.
Yeah, and in thinking again about the gift economy, it seems that these actions that you've just described are reciprocity in themselves. They're ways that we can give back. Would you say that's fair?
Oh, absolutely.
So something that really struck me about the idea of giving gifts back was that everyone has a gift and has the duty to use that gift. And as humans, our unique gift is language. Can you say more about that and how important it is for us to use our words as part of our gift back to the planet?
Thank you for asking that. That is a question and a practice which is so close to my heart, and I think can be transformative. Language is a mirror. How we speak is a mirror of how we think. And when we learn a particular language, it shapes our brains and our attitudes as well. And for example, let's start with one example of we call the world made up of natural resources. And it sounds it sounds so gentle and benign, but when what does that really mean? It means raw materials, means stuff we're going to extract. Commodities, exactly. It reminds me of, I was giving a talk at a large university in their College of Natural Resources, and they were also aware of oh, this is really not the best name. This is not fully what we do. It's not all about commodities. So we need a different name. And I sort of cheekily suggested to them that they changed their college name to the College of Earthly Gifts.
Oh, I love that.
So did they. It was a beautiful thing to see in the audience. Everybody's just like, "Oh yeah, I want a business card that says I work for the College of Earthly Gifts." Everyone was okay. It's a language shift, right? But with a very deep meaning. Um, and of course, they did change their name, not to the Department or the College of Earthly Gifts. I know. We'll get there. This is my goal in life. um, um, and they said it is a beautiful idea. It captures the world we want to live in. But wouldn't that put the kibosh on grounding up trees? Like, exactly. Language matters. Language matters. And as a student of my own Potawatomi language, I've come to understand how Indigenous languages hold a worldview that is of earthly gifts and kinfolk, that all of the plants and animals are our relatives. They're not things, they're not commodities or natural resources. And one of the best ways that I know of to illustrate this is with the way in English, let's say that we were going to go outside and visit with a serviceberry tree. In English, I might say, it's growing north of the building, right? Nothing troublesome about that. In English, if we don't know the name of a natural being, or even if we do, we call them it, right? Thousands of times a day. Would I ever say about you, it is asking really interesting questions?
I hope not.
Right, exactly. Because what does that do? It was disrespectful, right? I made you into an object. I dehumanized you. We would never do that to members of our own species, but we do it to every other species.
Yeah.
That's very revealing about the Western worldview that says, oh, we humans, we're deserving of a grammar of honor, but no one else is. Is it any wonder then that English is the language of global capitalism an extractive economy. If you it the world, it automatically says it's an object. It is outside our circle of moral responsibility. It's a thing, and things we may use however we wish. That's why there's no honorable harvest in Western economics, because you don't have to show honor to things. But if we referred to all living beings, as is true in my Potawatomi language, with the same grammar that we refer to our families with, now we're talking about consuming our family. And so you need ethics, you need the honorable harvest, and it's all tied up in language, which is all tied up in our values and our worldview. And that is so much why, as a scientist, this kind of comes back to your first question of how is science and writing and Indigenous knowledge all tied together. It all comes back to, for me, the power of storytelling, that the work of this scientist, of this nature writer at this moment is to try to change that story away from the itting of the world to the being of the world. And if we viewed the world as gift, if we viewed the world as our family, we would not be on the precipice of climate catastrophe.
In thinking about the importance of language, we're at the Museum of Science. We talk about science all the time, often with the language of science, which can feel exclusionary. It can feel inaccessible at times. So how do you see, native language or just native storytelling or storytelling in general combining with our scientific language to make it more accessible?
To me, it's not only a matter of accessibility, but a kind of inclusion and values that are associated with the objects in a museum. Oftentimes, that's how we talk, right? We have objects in our museum. What if we talked about having subjects in our museums? And when we talk about these elements that are present in our educational environment, if we talked about some ones, not some things, if we used a language of inclusion, if we used a language of that honors and acknowledges the personhood of the natural world, not the objecthood of the living world, I think that would go a long way toward inviting people into a compassionate consideration of the living world, not just in an objective consideration of the living world.
You write a lot about healing. I'm curious what you think healing would look like both on an individual and collective level as we think about healing our relationship with the planet.
One of the important elements in thinking about healing our relationship, just like any kind of healing, I think we have to name the wound. What is it that we're healing? What is the illness? What is the injury that needs healing? There are many, but at root, I think it is healing the notion that we humans are enemies of nature, that we are not part of nature, that we don't belong. And that story, which is so grounded in Western philosophy of human beings apart from nature, does real damage because it cuts us off from the understanding of mutual flourishing, that people can't be well unless the land is well, and the land can't be well unless people are in right relation with the land. So the healing steps that engagement with the natural world, engagement with storytelling, and the embrace of the wisdom of Indigenous cultures can bring us is this notion that human beings are a part of nature and can be a beneficial part of nature, that we can be medicine for the land. When I think about our prowess for ecological restoration, our prowess for land care in a compassionate way for the more than human beings as well as for our human neighbors. These are the healing steps that we can take, but it begins with that wonderful sense of humility to say that the living world is my kinfolk. I'm not in charge here. These are my relatives, and I will treat the living world as if these are all my relatives. I will treat the world not only as a source of belongings, but as our most fundamental source of belonging.
I love that. Wow. Like, we need the land and the land needs us.
Exactly.
Robin, thank you so much for being here. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for a great conversation, Eva.